Hi friends, my name is Lauren Ellerman. We are having a chat today and we are doing a Facebook Live. Myself and a good friend of mine from many years ago, Fiona, will be joining me in just a minute, and we are just doing the technical stuff so that I can get Fiona on this two-person chat. I appreciate the folks that have turned in. I see my good friend Alice is tuned in. Thanks, Alice. I know you know a lot of this stuff, but we're going to save this later for folks that are not in the medical or the legal community as well. It's not a super fun conversation to have, but a necessary conversation to have. So it'll just be a minute here, and I will get Fiona on. We did a test run yesterday. Hopefully the test run gave us the clues to how to do this today. Neither of us are tech people. When you have someone who works in a hospital and another person who was an English major at William & Mary, you don't get a lot of tech expertise. So here in just a minute, I'm going to have Fiona. Thanks, guys, for the patience. And I have to apologize in advance. You will hear dog barks, you will hear cat meows, you will hear all the things that comes with being at home in the middle of the day, because we are home today with a little bit of illness. One thing we learned yesterday during the test run is there is a lag between what we say and when the comments pop up. So if you do have questions, stick them in the comments, that's no problem. I'm just warning you that it might be 30 seconds to 45 seconds before we can see the comments and get to them. All right. So Fiona has joined here. And I'm trying to get her on. Fiona, if you can, there we go, there she is. Great, it's adding Fiona now. There she is.
Success.
Good. Can you hear me, friend?
I can.
Okay, good. It's a little fuzzy, but hopefully that's just on my end. Oh, now you're beautiful. I can see you. Hi, friends. I want to introduce you to my dear friend, Fiona. We decided yesterday we've known each other for probably 25 years. We met at William & Mary as undergrads, and our life paths have taken us in very different directions, but maybe back to a very similar theme. And so we're going to get started. We decided to have this conversation because we have it professionally all the time with the folks that see Fiona in the hospital under palliative care. I have it all the time as a malpractice lawyer because people call me after their loved ones didn't have a good death. And so this is an important conversation because once that bad thing has happened, Fiona can't help and I can't help. Once those decisions have been made, sometimes they can't be undone. And so we wanted to have this conversation just sort of as a courtesy for folks who understand that we are all mortal and we are all guaranteed a death. So that's where we're going to start. I'm going to turn it over to you, Fiona, and I'm going to ask you a question. You know, what do you think a good death is in your work in palliative care? And we'll start there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Fiona Sampey. I'm a physician assistant working in palliative care with postgrad training in that specialty. I've worked in this field for the past decade in a variety of settings and had the privilege of taking care of patients across the whole age range from neonates to geriatrics. For those of you who are not familiar with palliative care, it's specialized medical care for patients who have either life-threatening or chronic illness. And the care is focused on optimizing quality of life and reducing suffering. Hospice is part of the continuum of care for palliative care, but a lot of our care happens very upstream of end of life care. And I think that's going to be an important part of what we talk about today. So to your question, Lauren, what do I think of as a good death? That is obviously highly personal to every patient and family. I think there's a few components to it. I think place of care is a consideration, how much suffering individual or a family thinks is tolerable. And, both sides of that equation experience suffering. So I also think about, how families process a death afterwards. And that's a big part of the suffering that we try to alleviate. I love the Atul Gawande quote, endings matter, not just for the person, but perhaps even more for the ones left behind. And so really how we make a good death matter boils down to upstream communication and planning. And a lot of families, even families who are like thoughtful and loving and who have good dynamics, they forget to have these conversations upstream because how do you even start them?
Right. Fiona, when you and I were talking about this conversation, just so everyone knows, we are not talking about traumatic deaths and how to avoid a traumatic injury or a traumatic loss or a malpractice situation, which is what I deal with all the time. We're talking best case scenario where you do have a diagnosis, or even before a diagnosis where there's planning and conversations so that when that diagnosis happens, your family can be a little bit prepared for that. So I want you to know this is not a conversation on how to avoid trauma. This is not a conversation about how to avoid, misdiagnosis or a horrible outcome. This is a conversation about how to start legal and medical conversations early enough so that you don't find yourself in the ICU looking at each other going, gosh, I don't know what mom would have wanted. I have no idea what her wishes were. Or, I get calls all the time from family members who can't agree. I spoke to a family on Friday that were mad about an ICU intubating their mom. And I had to explain that that's what ICUs do. And that I was so sorry there was no communication, that no one explained that to them. They didn't have a DNR with them and the hospital didn't know that. But that's what this conversation is going to be, not about the trauma or the malpractice. So Fiona, you told me when we were preparing for this, there's something that you deal with in the palliative care space called the Conversation Project and the 5 Wishes.
Yeah.
Start and tell us a little bit about what that is as a conversation starter.
Yeah, so those are great tools that are available to any person or any family online. We can try to send those links around with the video after. But I think what I commonly come across is, friends asking, like, how do you even start this conversation? And so those are tools that really let people be thoughtful about what's important to them in their lives right now is like hopefully a healthy person making those decisions. What would be important to you if you had a life-threatening illness? And they go through kind of that decision making in a stepwise fashion, and I think touch on a lot of what we as palliative care providers do at the bedside. The important components that I think about when I'm talking to patients and families about this topic is, thinking about what kind of functional limitations do not align with your perspective on what a good quality of life is for you. And that's, again, highly personal. and, to give like some specific things to think about. When somebody gets intubated, say after like a cardiac or respiratory arrest, if they're not able to wean off of the ventilator, usually in a week or two, there's a discussion about placing a trach, which might be either for long-term or ideally short-term respiratory support. And so families don't usually anticipate that they are going to be put in the position to decide about that. Also thinking about, if you were in a situation where your illness rendered you long-term bedridden, is that acceptable to you? What about being in a memory care unit for a prolonged period of time? So there's all of these considerations that, it would be most helpful if the person themselves, the patient themselves, could engage in the conversation upstream and decide that for themselves. It's so immensely helpful, instead of a family just agonizing about how to make the right decision for both the patient and themselves, because it affects everybody. I would say that most people want to live as well as possible for as long as possible, but not necessarily just as long as possible. But that's sort of what our current like healthcare system is set up to support. And so if you don't think about these things upstream, that's what the trajectory will be, living as long as possible without really good attention to what the quality of that life looks like.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of where I get involved with families, right? Well, they call me and they say, my mom's in ICU. She had a stroke on Friday. They're saying now that she needs to be trached, and we have to send her to a nursing home, and there's only 2 in Western Virginia that allow trach patients. Which one's better? And you have to wonder, I mean, obviously this person on Thursday woke up not thinking that within a week they would be moving to a skilled nursing facility for the rest of their lives. And there's some really significant financial considerations about these decisions. And usually what happens when the hospital gives you the list of beds, you have no choice. It's you go to this facility an hour and a half away, or you go to this facility 2 hours away, and the family has an hour to decide. And so what we're going to talk about is how to avoid that, conversation. And Fiona, I mean, you and I, we come at this from personal and professional ways. We both lost our moms, who were just such powerhouses of personalities. And I remember sitting my mom down. She had multiple sclerosis. She had a chronic illness. I knew these issues were going to come to light. I knew we had to have these conversations. And I remember saying to my mom, Mom, I need to know if you want to live on a ventilator. And she said, well, Lauren, I want them to do everything possible to save me. I said, that's not the question I asked. Mm-hmm. I want to know if you want to live on a ventilator. I want to know if you want to live on a feeding tube. I want to know if you want to live with a catheter. You could live at home with a catheter, but then it's 24-hour nursing, and they're emptying your catheter bag, and then you're bedbound. And, she ended up being bedbound to some extent. But we had these hard conversations all the time, which made her transition, her death, so much easier, because my brother and I already had a plan. We knew what Mom wanted, what she didn't want. We knew she wanted to be in the home. We had hospice in right away. We had a plan, and that was such a blessing. I can't even imagine if he and I had been sitting in ICU arguing over this stuff. I mean, that's what we're trying to avoid. And one of the things I like to ask people is get real specific. Where, ideally, if you were queen of the world, where would you die? Would you be at home? Would you be in a hospital so that your family didn't have to do some of the medical? Do you have a hospice house in your community? We don't even have one yet in Roanoke. Mm-hmm. I mean, these questions to sort of ask, who do you want to be there? Do you want to be surrounded by friends and family and loved ones? During COVID, that wasn't an option in ICUs. I've heard so many awful stories about people who regret that their loved ones died alone because they didn't have that opportunity to bring them home. So I think it's important to just start with the logistics If you want to go to a nursing home, how are you going to pay for that? And we'll get into that question in a minute. Most people just assume that when they need nursing home care, they just apply for Medicaid and the government just magically pays for it. That's not what happens. And if you don't plan this, you get caught in a really stressful financial situation. So we will share the conversation project in the 5 wishes, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about everybody communicating to their loved ones. Here are my wishes. Best case scenario, this is where I want to go and how I want to go. And here's the amount of suffering I'm willing to endure, right?
And I a little, understand that some of this is pie in the sky. For the moms out there, it's a little like figuring out your delivery plan that then ends up being different than what you envisioned in your head. But I think the best way to ensure that some of the important components are met, or there's a chance of meeting them, is to talk about it upstream. But you can't orchestrate some of these situations either.
That's exactly right. I know on Friday I had a friend from William and Mary call me because a loved one was needing home health really quick and after an acute medical issue, and they're out of town and they didn't know how to do home health. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we probably are all going to need at some point unless we magically all die in our sleep. And so it's good to know, what does your insurance cover? And if you don't know the answers to these things, you can find them out. You can call me. I'll tell you what Medicare covers. I'll tell you what Medicaid covers. We can have a financial conversation. We do that for free all the time. But also what's in your community, and anybody can look into that, Fiona. I know where you work, a lot of small communities send their healthcare to your town. Same in Roanoke. You have people driving an hour and a half to the hospital. Is that how you want your family to spend their last days, on the road? I mean, lots of questions to ask. All right, Fiona, you had on your great conversation, and I'm gonna talk logistics about if you were not able to make healthcare decisions for yourself, you should have already appointed one member of your family to do it for you, not two. And this is, I don't do wills and estates, but for years I've encouraged my clients to pick one member of their family. But they feel bad because they have 3 children and they don't want the other 2 children to feel sad. I don't care about people's feelings when it comes to hard conversations. Pick the most stubborn, determined, and forceful person. Don't pick the shrinking violet child, right? Don't pick the one that doesn't like conflict, that doesn't like hard decisions. Pick them to be the person who nurses you back to health, but don't pick them to be the one that makes the hard decisions. And be open about it. Tell your other kids, if your spouse is a shrinking violet, don't have them make these decisions for you. Sit them down and say, I love you, but I know this is going to be hard for you, so I've appointed niece Amanda. Warn people beforehand. Let them know who's the decision maker and who's not. And when you write that document, and yes, it's important to go to an actual lawyer. A lawyer can do all of these documents for you for less than about $2,000. Please don't buy them on LegalZoom because LegalZoom documents are terrible. But go to a lawyer, get your healthcare power of attorney, get your general power of attorney, appoint one person, not 2. Because if you appoint 2, they all have to agree. Mm-hmm. And if you want a DNR, have it in the hospital file before, have it in your primary care physician file before, have it with the ambulance, have it in your room. If you call 911, you tell them, I have a DNR, it's here, pick it up. Otherwise, we get a lot of folks calling and saying, my mom had a DNR and she was put through needless suffering. Well, if they don't know, it's their job to save a life, right? That's what the EMT's job is, and the emergency room job, and the ICU job. So have those documents, pick one person, pick a stubborn person. They don't have to be local. And that is sort of step 1 of the legal planning. And it doesn't have to be someone who lives nearby, because with phones, I was my mom's healthcare power of attorney. I was 6 states away, but man, I could call the ICU and fax them the documents and get it done. Fiona, what do you think step 1 is beyond just the conversation in your world? Is it putting it to writing? Do you want to see a plan? Mom didn't want a feeding tube, mom didn't want to be intubated, or are you okay with a conversation with that healthcare surrogate? Do you feel in your world that's enough?
Yeah, I think the most important piece is having the documentation of who the healthcare power of attorney is. The legal default is if you're married, it's your spouse. If you're not and you have adult children, those are the next proxy. And then if you're not married and don't have adult children, it would be your parents. There's, subtle variances per state, but that's kind of generally the order. And I wholeheartedly echo what Lauren said, like only have one person listed in the hospital. I just kick everyone out of the room so that the patient can like freely identify who that should be and don't feel pressured to appoint someone who would not honor their wishes. And like Lauren said, I feel like so many people just pick who lives closest to them, and it's really irrelevant. Like, you don't need to be physically present to be the power of attorney. You just need to be knowledgeable about what is important to your loved one, and then honor that. What we see happen a lot, especially in the emergency room, is that if you're the healthcare power of attorney and the patient can't speak for themselves, the power of attorney can override any other decisions past that are written down, unless you've like specified in your paperwork that you won't allow them do that. But most people have not specified that. And so, there are a lot of conversations that happen in real time about what the best path forward is based on the situation. I think if you have, firm wishes about not being resuscitated, that should be in writing. The best way to document that is something called a POST form, which is done with a healthcare provider. If you fill it out yourself, like you can find it online, but if you fill it out yourself and sign it, it's not valid without like a physician or PA or NP's signature on it. And that is honored, both in the hospital and out in the community. So if you have one, put it on your fridge at home. Emergency responders look for it there. And it's a way of documenting limitations. So if you want all aggressive medical care, you don't need a POST. But if you would not want to be resuscitated, which means compressions and intubation, those two things almost always go together, then that should be documented on a POST form. You can also document wishes around a feeding tube. That's not usually something we need to know in an emergency. And I find that people either have really strong feelings about not wanting that, or they're unsure. So if you have strong feelings, then, that's a way to document also.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important. And Fiona, I don't like keeping family secrets because that's where the bedside distrust and hard conversations have. So when you have these documents, make copies for everybody, right? I'm not saying your will, but have your healthcare power of attorney. Everybody needs to have a copy. Your doctor needs to have a copy. The hospital needs to have a copy. You need to have a copy in your purse. This is not the kind of thing you put in your filing cabinet and never get out again. It can only be useful if people have it, right? You
Yeah.
have that. And Fiona was
Can I
mentioning. Oh yeah, go ahead.
There's also repositories in some states.
Mm-hmm.
So you can send all of your documents into the repository. And what that means is, regardless of what healthcare facility you're being cared for, we can find the document. So like, I live in Montana, but if you were traveling here from Virginia, I could go in the Virginia repository and find your document. So I think that's another safeguard. Like, just putting it in your locked safe at home, it doesn't help anybody.
No, it doesn't help anybody except the lawyer who charged you for it.
Yeah.
Right? The only person who benefits from that. So, and what age group needs a healthcare power of attorney? Anybody. Anybody does. When you become a parent, you need to have this stuff. When you have, during COVID, we all needed to have this stuff. My friends who were wills and estates lawyers were very busy during COVID because people for the first time in a long time, considered their mortality.
Mm.
As a human being, these decisions are going to be made about you or by you, and so you should have one. And you know, if you get a divorce, or you know, all of a sudden your adult children become big jerks and you don't want them to make those decisions, you can change it. It's not that hard, it's not that expensive, but it is important to at least have a baseline written document that outlines who makes those healthcare decisions.
And if you do get a divorce and your ex-spouse is listed on your paperwork, there is a safeguard, like it's no longer honored that that is your proxy. We see that sometimes. So
Yep, exactly. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to mention is, other than the healthcare power of attorney, what legal documents should you also have so that you can pie in the sky, like a birth plan, have the best possible death, right? That's the goal, is to end life with joy and less suffering, and to have those moments where a family can appreciate the beauty of a life well lived, not all of the hard stuff. I think everybody needs to have a will. And even if you don't have assets, that's what I hear all the time from folks is, well, no, my mom didn't have a will because she didn't have assets. Well, let me tell you what happens in the state by state variation. But if you don't have a will, then just like Fiona says, the law already says who gets what based on their legal or blood relation to you. So as a spouse in Virginia, you'd be entitled to a third. But what if you separated 5 years ago? Nope, they're still entitled to a third. So there are things that the law cannot anticipate, and that's why you need a will. If you, I mean, I see this a lot. I live in Appalachia. Dope Sick was not a fictional account, right? We have a really big problem with drug addiction, especially with opioids. And so parents will come to me in like a medical malpractice case, and they'll say, well, you know, my mom died and it was someone's fault, but we don't want my brother to get any money because he's an addict. And if he gets money, he'll OD, he'll just go buy stuff and he'll OD. And they'll say, the law doesn't care. Your mom didn't have a will. So have a will. Even if it says I give everything to my 3 legal, you know, my children equally divided, that is a very helpful thing to have. And in the will, specify, if you can, or in a letter attached to your will, where you want to be buried, if you want to be cremated. Guys, part of a good death, as Fiona already said, is the people you leave behind. And when we posted this, Fiona, a good friend of mine emailed to say that her dad has a file in his filing cabinet that he has updated for the last 30 years called When I Die. And he's got the hymns, he's written his obituary, he knows where he wants to be buried, he's pre-played for his burial, he's taken the guesswork out. He's a lawyer, so this was a gift to his family. But that is a gift. It is absolutely a gift. Does it mean a better death for you? No. Does it mean less suffering for your family? Yes. If they're not battling about whether or not you want a funeral, or whether or not, you know, there's literally an article in our paper this week about a family who's trying to bury their mom at her church cemetery, but the church is claiming she's no longer a member, so they're not going to let her be buried in the church cemetery, right? So this poor family is not only grieving a loss, they now might be in a legal battle with this Baptist church to whether or not mom can be buried in the cemetery. My mom gave me the greatest gift, and then I'll shut up. I'll never forget this. 2 years before she passed, she was visiting me in Roanoke, and she said, Mom, Lauren, what cemetery do you drive by the most? And I said, why, Mom? She said, because I want to be buried there. And I said, why? She said, because I want you to come visit me all the time. So she said, let's call the cemetery. We'll go by, we'll pick out some plots, and then if we have time, we'll go for lunch. So that's exactly what we did. I called the cemetery. The guy got in the car. We drove around. Mom looked at a pretty hill. She said, that's lovely. And she said, I see that beautiful cross headstone. Was he a nice man? And I said, yes, ma'am. Small town. I know him. He was a lovely man. And my mom goes, well, great. I'd like to be his neighbor. She buys 3 cemetery plots. We go to lunch. And then 2 years later, when she dies during COVID, what a gift, right? I knew where she wanted to be buried. I knew the hymn she wanted. That is a gift to your family. You can write it in an email. That's what my dad has done for me. He sent me an email with the name of the funeral home guy that he's already planned it with. He's healthy as a horse. But what a gift that you are thinking of those things so your loved one doesn't have to. So a will, number 1. Healthcare power of attorney number 2, a plan for your burial. And if you want to prepay for it, wonderful. What a gift that your family doesn't have to do that. And if you're not a person of means, that's okay too, right? You can have a life insurance policy that's maybe $30 a month that will pay for your burial. So there are very simple steps you can do that actually prevent some additional suffering for your loved one. And I think those are the 3 sort of most important steps. The 4th, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Fiona, is talking about Medicare and Medicaid. And if you need long-term care, who's going to pay? I get this call a lot. My mom all of a sudden needs nursing home care, so I'm going to need someone to gift her house to me, gift her car to me, gift all of her assets to me so she looks poor so she can get Medicaid. That's fraud. You're not allowed to do that. Nobody knows that that's fraud though, right? Everybody just assumes that the government is there to pay for a nursing home if you need it. It's not true. So if you have a chronic illness and you say to your family, I don't want you to move in and take care of me, I want there to be a facility that eventually does that, you also need to have a Medicaid planning attorney involved, right? And that is not the most expensive attorney you'll ever hire, but it is the most necessary, because otherwise, if you don't do that when you die and you've lived in a nursing home, the state takes all your assets. The state takes your home. The state takes your car. Your children get nothing. So that's an important asterisk. If you think long-term care and you don't have millions of dollars in the bank, which is what it costs, then you need to have a Medicaid attorney. No surprises. And the best gift is tell everybody. Fiona, could you share, this is not on our script, love, but sort of the difference between a family that you have seen who has all of this planned out and what that end of life looks like compared to a family that doesn't? I mean, just practically speaking, what it means for both the patient and the family.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is something that causes, like, if the patient is conscious at end of life, I find people to spend their last days like worrying about some of these things. And it's just terribly tragic to witness that, being at the bedside in the hospital and someone's like worrying about how their funeral's going to be covered and how the family members are going to interact with each other. I I would say that, sometimes there's a lot of time to make preparation, like it sounds like with your mom. And other times things happen really fast. And both situations are hard in different ways. I think when it happens really fast, there's so many like medical decisions that families are being asked about, and then they're trying to deal with all of these like financial logistic pieces at the same time, like sometimes in, a matter of days, and that is very stressful. um, I, like Lauren was saying, come to this conversation from a personal place too. My mom died in an unexpected and traumatic way. And the ironic thing is, when she died, I had already been a palliative care provider. And uh, a couple Christmases before that, I had put copies of the 5 Wishes in everyone's stockings. And, I knew these conversations were important and that we hadn't had them. And everyone kind of rolled their eyes at me. No one ever filled them out. I had conversations with my mom about pieces of this, and I knew her really well. And, part of the complex grief after her death in our family was that people did not align about a lot of these logistics, and it created tremendous suffering and strife that is long lasting and just, I think, so preventable. And so, I've experienced that, and I would not wish that on anybody. And then, yeah, I've seen families like yours, Lauren, who just really have a sense of peace at end of life, because they are just there to be present for the person who's dying and to enjoy like whatever time they have left. And I'm just always in awe of when that happens. I would say that happens less often than the opposite. And it's because culturally we shy away from having these conversations.
Right, right. I know, and I'm telling a story I don't have permission to share, but my husband was present for the death of his grandmother, who he was very close with. And she was in palliative care after a stroke, and they knew it could be minutes to days, but the whole family came, and there were days where there were 3 grandkids holding hands and telling stories, and then there were days where there were great grandkids running around the hospital room, and it became a place of peace because it became a place of remembering. But also it's because this woman made her wishes very clear. She pulled Whit and I aside after law school and said, I want to donate my body to science. You don't let anybody say no to that. I want to be a guinea pig. So here's all the paperwork. I'm getting it notarized. You have copies. And she was so stubborn. She knew exactly what she wanted, which was such a blessing, right? So when the organ donation people came in and said, you know, we hate to have this conversation, but we were like, hey, no, it's great. Granny wanted this conversation. Here's her paperwork. She signed it 4 years ago. You know, it made it so much easier. And you know, one of the things I hear a lot from the families who call me, so I'm a medical malpractice plaintiff's attorney. So the people call me after their loved one has not had a good death, but a lot of it is because of bad communication, or they don't understand what's happening to their loved one. And I'll give you an example of that, Fiona. I had a person call me recently who couldn't understand why her 56-year-old husband died all of a sudden, and no one had explained anything to her. And so she just assumed something went wrong. I requested the medical records. Well, he had pancreatic cancer, and I think he'd known about it, but he didn't tell his wife, right? And so her grief turned into anger, not at him, but at the healthcare community, because she didn't understand how he could have gone from being so healthy to so unhealthy so quickly, and no one explained it to her. He didn't mean to leave that complex grief for her, but by not communicating, he had. And so if you are a loved one who is forced to have these conversations with medical providers, ask all the questions. If we take her off life support, will it be minutes? Will it be days? Do you know? Can she stay here? Do we have to move her? Who pays for that? And I can easily post tomorrow on this thread the 20 questions I would ask a palliative care provider that I would want to know. And Fiona, you and I can come up with the things that you tell your patients. But they don't know what questions to ask until it's too late. And then they get home and they call me because they didn't ask those questions. And so they just have a bad feeling that something was hidden from them, but really there wasn't that dialogue. And I know you well enough to know that your patients get that dialogue, but sometimes the families don't seem interested in the dialogue, or maybe they weren't there the whole time, so they don't know what was said to their brother or their father or whoever. So maybe there's some things that you make sure you explain to families when they have to make that palliative care decision. What kinds of things do you tell families?
Yeah, so we try to meet people, you know, as upstream as possible in the disease process. It sort of depends on their, you know, subspecialist or primary care provider offering that. But if you're in this position, you know, have a life limiting illness or something complex, and there's palliative care available at your facility, one of the things that we can help with is translating complex discussions.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the first thing, you know, I oftentimes go with subspecialists, like say an oncologist or a neurologist, to a patient's bedside when they're giving like diagnosis or prognostic information. And I find that a lot of the important details are kind of left unsaid, or like the provider thinks it's implied, but the family's so overwhelmed that they hear a fraction of the conversation. Like once the diagnosis is verbalized, there's, you know, inability to kind of retain the rest of the conversation. And so like things that I like to ask on behalf of the patient and family is, what's the most likely outcome for this specific patient? It doesn't matter what all the stats say about, you know, how many patients survive to 5 years, what's the best outcome, what's the worst outcome. The most important thing is, what's the most likely outcome for you, you know, at your disease and stage and with whatever comorbidities you have. And then what that information means in terms of life expectancy. And providers will shy away from that. They'll say like, oh, I don't know, or they'll again give like the range of how long you could live. And so you can ask them to give an estimate in a range. And so we can say things like Lauren was saying, of like hours to days, days to weeks, weeks to months. What that information gives you is quality of life. You know, if you know that you are only going to have a few months to live, probably the way you would spend that time is a lot different than if you understand that you are going to have decades to live. So I would ask about that. And then also asking what the intent is of the treatment that you're being offered. So oncologists are taught to tell patients that their disease is treatable. Treatable does not mean curable, but that's what most people hear. And then they're surprised, like Lauren's example, you know, that this patient died from pancreatic cancer, which,
Right.
you know, depending on the stage, is likely not curative. Um, and then, you know, asking about the burdens of treatment. So these are the quality of life considerations. As you're going through treatment, how much time are you going to be spending at a healthcare facility? How ill are you going to be feeling through that course? I think about this a lot with patients who are offered long-term dialysis, and they're spending, you know, the better part of a day, multiple times a week at a dialysis center. They're super fatigued all the other days in between.
Yep.
There's consideration of like who is going to be providing transport to and from dialysis. And we don't do a good job as healthcare providers of talking about that burdens piece, but it's what matters the most. That also ties into like, are you going to be able to live independently at home, or is part of the burden needing to move out of your home? Where's that facility? Is it, you know, in your same town, or are you needing long-term care that's not available in your geographic location? So and I would say, you know, I touched on this earlier, but in the current medical environment, is a lot that we can offer patients, and all treatments and interventions are not in every patient's best interest. So being like brave enough to recognize that, and, you know, choose a path forward that actually provides good quality of life for you and your loved ones. And then the last piece of that is, I find that patients are often given kind of this array of options, like we're in a cafeteria line.
Mm.
And some families are able to kind of weed through all of those options. Other families, they don't really have a great understanding of what kind of the risks and burdens are of all of the options. And I try to get providers to then give families in that situation a medical recommendation. And we like to shy away from that because it seems paternalistic, but it can also be a gift to be told, like, this is what's medically appropriate. You know, I'm sure in your field, Lauren, you hear about like futile like medical futility. And so this is another way of looking at like what's medically appropriate, what's medically inappropriate. And if you're not sure, ask the provider to give the recommendation. People don't generally like being asked, like, what would you do if it was like your mom or your dad? But the same way of asking that is like, what's your recommendation? What's the most medically appropriate choice? And then they can answer that. They should. And if you're not getting these answers from your provider, then maybe you should be asking to talk to someone else, because this is pretty basic and should be part of the overall conversation.
Agreed. And I tell folks all the time, listen, when you're in a traumatic conversation, you're not going to remember it. Write it down. Or, I mean, I know no one likes to be recorded, but say to the doctor, this is an important conversation. I want to share it with my brother. And I asked an ICU doctor one time, can I record our call so I can send it to my brother? And he said, absolutely. I mean, this was not, I wasn't trying to sue anybody. This was because I knew in that moment, my brain was not going to remember this stuff. And so I think there are ways to sort of slow down and have these important conversations and get the answers that your provider knows. They know. I mean, I hear all the time, and I get this call, you know, my loved one had this horrible thing happen, and now they're on a ventilator in a nursing home, and they've been there for 9 months. And I say to this person in love, I say, why are you keeping them on a ventilator in a nursing home for 9 months? And they'll say to me, because I'm praying and I believe in a miracle, and this person's a fighter. And I'll say, I know that. But did any doctor look you in the eye and say that in their 30 years, they've never seen anyone survive this? No. Did you ask? No. Let's ask. Let's ask, because, you know, I'll never forget a young woman, her husband had a horrible thing happen, and she wanted him to live on a ventilator so that the kids would have a father. But then those kids' only memory of their father is walking into a nursing home and seeing a body in a bed. Yeah. And I think about those kids all the time, and I think about that family all the time, and how I wish and prayed someone had sort of had a hard conversation with this very loving wife early on to say, you know, it may be better for your kids if they don't see that. Mm-hmm. It may be better for your family if your entire life is not revolved around, you know, visiting this nursing home once a week for the next 3 to 4 years, or the ping pong of back to the hospital when bed sores develop. And I mean, I'll never forget, my mom had bed sores because she was bedridden and part of her story. And I remember looking at the hospital staff, her last hospitalization, and said, please stop turning her. You're torturing her. And they said, well, but the bed sores will get worse. I said, I know, but she's being tortured. Please stop. We know this is what's going to happen to her. And at the same time, they had a job, and it was to turn her every 2 hours to prevent other bed sores. But I knew what it looked like in the end. I was blessed to know that. But you have to be in conversation, right? You have to be in conversation.
I wonder if that family with the young children that you described, also if they were ever given permission to make a different decision.
Right. Because you made the point, it's easier to say, no, we don't want a ventilator than it is to take someone off the ventilator, right?
Yeah.
It's a really hard decision to feel. And I get the guilt calls all the time. You know, it's my fault this bad thing happened to my mom. I'm the one that chose this nursing home, or I'm the one that chose this doctor. I didn't realize how sick she was. Guilt and grief are really intertwined. And to give our children, to give our loved ones the gift of a less complex grieving period, of a less hard grieving period, we might want to have those conversations a little bit more clearly. Mm-hmm. So that we forgive them, and that they don't have that grief and that guilt. But you're right. I wish someone had pulled that young woman aside and said, gosh, you were such a loving wife. Maybe the most loving thing to do right now for your family would be to let him go. But they didn't. And, you know, part of me thinks, well, because the nursing home made money, and, you know, he was an easy patient. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes I think the worst that we put profits over people, but maybe it's just we don't like to have hard conversations. Mm-hmm. And I think what you and I are agreeing is that they're really necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that part that you just touched on is super important, like thinking of what are the downstream effects of the decisions you're making. Like if you put in a feeding tube, at some point you might be in the position of having to make the decision to remove it because it's not supporting good quality of life. And like initiating or withdrawing support, it's actually exactly, or not initiating or withdrawing is exactly the same, but emotionally it feels very, very different to everyone, like the healthcare providers and most importantly, the family. But if that's not, a downstream decision that you feel comfortable making, then you should be really thoughtful about that upstream.
I know I witnessed a loved one who had a stroke and was put on a ventilator. And I remember saying to the provider, I was not their healthcare power of attorney, but I was close enough where I said, this person had a DNR. She didn't want to be on a ventilator. And they said, yes, but the daughter wants them on a ventilator because the daughter thinks they're a fighter. And here I was stuck between, I knew this person's legal wish, but I wasn't the one to make it. The person who was making the decision wasn't honoring the wish. That's complicated. That's really hard. And finally, this loved one said, okay, I agree. They're not going to live. We'll take them off the ventilator. But that was a really hard decision. And I think about if they'd honored it in the beginning, would they feel less guilt?
Mm-hmm.
If they'd known how strongly that person believed, would they feel less guilt?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This could be a whole other topic, but like we do have some good language for responding to that, like fighter, miracle, hope, um, thought frame that people often have. And it's just like reframing that to like, I know, they're a fighter and, they have done everything possible to try to survive this illness. Like, what else would they be fighting for if survival isn't possible? Would they be fighting to have like a peaceful and dignified end? And you can say the same thing with like a miracle. Like maybe if that miracle isn't possible, like another miracle would be them having a good death.
Yeah.
And use the same language to kind of get acknowledgement of what's, actually the reality of the situation.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you my prayer for years, knowing, when you're bedridden and you can't walk, what that looks like. My prayer for my mom for years was, Lord, please don't let her suffer. And so I would tell every healthcare provider, hey, listen, we are here to prevent her suffering. So if this does that, then we will agree. And if it doesn't, then the answer is no. Send us home, right? But because I'm a strong personality, I had no problem going toe to toe and being like, does she need that whole bag of antibiotics when she can't breathe? I don't think she does. Does she need that oxygen when at this point her brain isn't responding anymore? I mean, but I'm not a doctor, but I was strong enough to be like, I don't think she wants those tubes. Let's take them off. So it's important. At this point, Fiona, you and I have kind of gone through most of our outline and we've got about 10 minutes left, but no one has asked any questions. So if you have a question, we would love it. You can write it in the comments right now. We are going to save this conversation for later so you can share it with loved ones. Maybe a thing to do is take this conversation, email it to a loved one and say, hey, why don't we have this conversation? I love you and want to make sure you've thought about these decisions. Who do you want to be your healthcare power of attorney? How can I help you? So that there is peace. And then flip side is help me, right? Like if I'm in a relationship, even as a daughter, my mom knew what I wanted to happen to me. God forbid she have to lose a daughter. So I think it's not just an age thing. It goes both ways.
Right.
Yeah. Well, no one is chiming in with questions. So Fiona and I have promised two things. She's going to give us a list of the conversation project and the 5 wishes, which I think will be really helpful. We'll put that here on the chat question and answer. And then Fiona and I will also add the questions that you should ask your palliative care or your provider when you have that serious medical diagnosis. And you want to know, what does this look like in a week? What does this look like in a month? How do we pay for those treatments? Who does that treatment? What does it look like for the family? We can post those questions too, so that people have that as a resource.
I give a little plug for my side project too.
Yes.
So I am going to start doing a consult service that's community based for individuals and families around having these conversations. And I'll have Lauren send out my email. And if you want to be on my list when I launch that website soon with more information, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to help you and your families.
And it doesn't matter where they live, right, Fiona? You can do that on
Yeah,
Zoom. You can do it on,
right.
and it's just, you start the difficult conversation and create a space where everybody can come up with these answers so that when the bad thing happens, some of these issues have already been decided.
Yeah, I think it can be helpful to have a third party who's not, personally and emotionally invested in the conversation, but knows how to navigate it. And then the hope is it gives you the tools to continue having the conversation, because it's never just one conversation. It's something that evolves. But I think from piloting it, when I've had the conversation with families, it becomes way less stigmatized and more accessible to them to pick it up at another
Yeah.
time.
I think that's beautiful. I know and things do change. I remember my mom had to be intubated emergently, and she was on an event for 48 hours. And when she woke up and she recovered and came home, which was a miracle, she said, never again. She said it was awful. She said, I was aware, I was conscious, it was awful. And she actually hit my brother when she came off the vent, because in her mind, he had put her on it. And so she was mad at him, and she was like, never again. So, we end with a joke, but at the same time, her wish has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really glad that we knew that, because that was a really important thing. Yep. All right, Fiona, I love you, dear. So good to see you. Thank you for tuning in, friends. And if you have other questions, I'll post Fiona's email and my email here. We'd love to help out later.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks everyone for joining.